Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's important for me today to have the opportunity to speak on Bill C-8 from the unceded territory of the Wolastoq. What is a nation and what does it mean to be a Canadian citizen? Bill C-8 is an act to amend the Citizenship Act. The bill would change the oath of citizenship for newcomers to Canada to include recognition and affirmation of the treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As I have proudly mentioned many times in this House, before I joined federal politics, I was a teacher. When I think about this bill and the oath of citizenship, I think about what it teaches us about who we are and who we want to be. In my time at Fredericton High School as a cultural transition coordinator for Indigenous youth, I helped run a Native Education Center. My role was to ensure students were welcomed, supported, empowered, and that they had access to the materials and resources they needed for success, often a tall order in a large institution. I had the pleasure of working closely with the English as a Second Language department for newcomer students who were in the same wing. My goal was to facilitate learning about Indigenous culture and heritage with my students, but also with the wider school population and staff. I would create bulletin boards with information, spotlight incredible Indigenous leaders, actors, artists, language keepers, visit classes, or host professional development seminars. It wasn't long before the ESL department requested that I come in and speak with their students who were very curious about my role. I noticed that the Welcome to Canada curriculum that the ESL teachers had been given represented Indigenous peoples with a totem pole, a teepee, and an inukshuk. Beyond these superficial symbolic images, there was no substance, no discussion of rights, of the peace and friendship treaties in our territory, of the different Wabanaki nations on the East Coast, no highlight of the 15 communities in New Brunswick, 9 Mi'kmaq, and 6 Wolastoq. We started to hold group potlucks with traditional foods, sometimes in our space and sometimes in theirs. Beyond the cultural exchange, I noticed the bonds that the youth were making with one another, and I noticed the pride being a part of Canada's mosaic. We are strengthened by our diversity, and it was beautiful to witness an exercise in community building. These students had more in common than they first believed. Many were subjected to prejudice, discrimination, and racism. I also noticed that newcomer students began to open up more about their homelands or refugee experiences. They identified with the history of colonialism they were learning, and they were excited by the Indigenous cultural resurgence happening in local nations because of the hope it offered. Madam Speaker, it is a rare opportunity to connect our desire to welcome newcomers with honesty about the sovereignty of Indigenous nations. This is important work that we are undertaking. We cannot ignore the reason why we are here tonight. It is to discuss Bill C-8 and to expedite its passage into Canadian law. However, this urgency comes from the horrific discovery of the remains of 215 children at the former Kamloops residential schools. It should not have taken this latest revelation of wrongdoing to prompt action. We have known the impact of residential schools in this country for decades, at least those of us who bothered to listen. The children have pushed the truth to the surface. No one can say they didn't know. And newcomers to Canada will have to come to terms with these realizations as well, out of respect to the original inhabitants of this land, the ones who are still here and the ones who never came home. The oath, Madam Speaker, is as follows. I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen. Upholding this oath requires a further in-depth conversation about colonialism, the British Crown, and its role in the atrocities of residential schools and ongoing oppression, of monies and Crown lands held in trust by Her Majesty the Queen on behalf of Indigenous peoples. As for the faithful observation of laws in Canada, including treaties, we have much work to do. Canadians have very little understanding of our treaty relationship, and this became painfully obvious during the Mi'kmaq fishery dispute. While we stand here today to hopefully unanimously pass Bill C-8, implementing Call to Action 94 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Call to Action 93 has been stalled since June 2018, when the federal government said changes to the information kit for newcomers was close to completion. Can we have an update on this? Can we have a status report on all calls to action? This is what the survivors, those descendants of settlers, and certainly newcomers, need from this government. The Liberal government has completed an average of only 2 TRC calls to action per year since 2015. At this rate, it will take until 2062 to complete all 94. My children will likely have their own children by then. These are steps in the right direction, but I'd like to share the reflections of a person from my riding. And this is what they said. I'm hopeful that people will finally read the recommendations. Maybe finding more human bodies will wake people up to the notion that each of these recommendations addresses a specific concern. The onus should be on our government to explain why they are not adopting specific recommendations versus our current system of applauding them when they pick and choose off the list like it is. I appreciate this wisdom. The calls to action represent a package of reforms that create a roadmap for reconciliation. We must walk that road step by step, recommendation by recommendation. And rather than applause for hand selecting the 11th and 12th recommendations to enshrine over a 6-year period, we need to be seeing status reports on the implementation, demanding more accountability from this government when they fall short, when we all fall short. Specifically, I'd like to read out recommendations 71 to 76 here today, as they relate so directly to the lost children in Kamloops and those across the nation who remain invisible. Under missing children and burial information, call to action 71. We call upon all chief coroners and provincial vital statistics agencies that have not provided to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada their records on the deaths of Aboriginal children in care of the residential school authorities to make these documents available to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. Number 72, we call upon the federal government to allocate sufficient resources to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to allow it to develop and maintain the National Residential School Student Death Register established by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. 73, we call upon the federal government to work with churches, Aboriginal communities, and former residential school students to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries, including, where possible, plot maps showing the location of deceased residential school children. 74, we call upon the federal government to work with the churches and Aboriginal community leaders to inform the families of children who died at residential schools of the child's burial location, and to respond to families' wishes for appropriate commemoration ceremonies and markers and reburial in home communities where requested. 75, we call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, churches, Aboriginal communities, former residential school survivors, and current landowners to develop and implement strategies and procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or other sites at which residential school children were buried. This is to include the provision of appropriate memorial ceremonies and commemorative markers to honor the deceased children. 76, we call upon the parties engaged in the work of documenting, maintaining, commemorating, and protecting residential school cemeteries to adopt strategies in accordance with the following principles. Number 1, the Aboriginal community most affected shall lead the development of such strategies. Number 2, information shall be sought from residential school survivors and other knowledge keepers in the development of such strategies. And number 3, Aboriginal protocol shall be respected before any potentially invasive technical inspection and investigation of a cemetery site. We also need to provide the space to grieve. There was a collective sadness being felt across this country. This is the truth that comes before the reconciliation. We had to come to this point of reckoning to wake up those who were still sleeping. Now that we know, we cannot unknow. Enshrining acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples into the newcomer citizenship oath asks us to never forget. I support Bill C-8, and I ask my colleagues in the Senate to agree. Let's get this done. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Adorable to see that little young one. Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, First Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank the member for her speech, and I know I'm often in the same boat at home, juggling family as well as work in the House of Commons. And for those of us who are young parents, we all have to, I think, confront this challenge of how we talk to our children about Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, how we explain the pride we feel in Canada, and yet the shame we feel about things that were done in the name of our country, perhaps in the name of communities we're a part of. So I wonder if the member just wants to share a little bit about how she tries to engage in these conversations, in particular with the next generation, how we explain what happened and how we explain what we plan to do going forward.
The Honourable Member for Frederick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for that question and recognition of the tough balance of work life sometimes. My 2 children are here with me in the office tonight, and my oldest, he's in grade 3, and I think that the revelation hit him pretty hard, and it hit his classmates hard and his community members. Ormukta First Nation is where he is a band member, and members came forward and put children's shoes in the shape of a heart, and they lit it up at night. And it's difficult to drive by, and it's difficult to have those conversations with your children. My son, he's got an introduction to residential schools before because his mom is very passionate about having him be proud of his heritage, and to learn, the difficult road that his ancestors had to take as well. So this is very much a sensitive issue for me. It hits close to home, and I do all I can to have these tough conversations. There's storybooks we can read that are appropriate for children, and if anyone would like to reach out, I have lots of recommendations that I can pass forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie ma collègue de Fredericton pour son discours. Je salue son petit bonhomme qui est absolument adorable au passage. J'aimerais entendre ma collègue puisqu'elle ne siégeait pas au comité INAN où on a eu la discussion justement sur le texte, le libellé du serment de citoyenneté. On a entendu mes collègues en chambre ce soir qui semblaient avoir une certaine insensibilité par rapport à cet enjeu-là pour le Québec. Donc, j'aimerais tout simplement l'entendre. Est-ce qu'elle aurait eu une compréhension différente de pourquoi c'est un enjeu pour le Bloc québécois et dans un souci d'en arriver à l'unanimité, est-ce qu'elle aurait soutenu un amendement du Bloc québécois afin de retirer tout simplement la reconnaissance de la Constitution dans le libellé du serment de citoyenneté?
L'honorable député de Fredericton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honorable colleague. And my son is adorable, and I respect, the nation of Quebec. I respect, the sovereignty. I respect their individualized culture, and I think it's important to add that to the conversation as well. This is about respecting everyone's background and heritage and culture, and coming to Canada and building a nation where we truly all belong, where we feel included and represented. And so I'm very open to working with Bloc members to assure that there's amendments that they're comfortable with. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable member for Powell River North Island.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member so much for her speech today. I really deeply appreciated it. I'm wondering, for me, I ran a nonprofit organization that supported newcomers to Canada for many years, and one of the things that we learned was often Indigenous communities were not something that they knew a lot about. And sometimes they would come into Canada and they would hear from other people, really discriminatory aspects of that perspective, and didn't understand the history. And when they learned the history, it was very overwhelming sometimes because there were some stories that really related to the experience that they had had in their home country. So I'm just wondering if the member could speak a little bit about how important it is to have that acknowledgement in our citizenship oath so that we encourage all members of the community that becomes Canadian to know the history of our country in this context.
The honourable member for Fredericton, 30 seconds.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I thank my honourable colleague as well. I think, I was a little bit more cynical about this call to action, but the more I thought about it, the more I think it's so important to enshrine up front, when that important learning is happening about, coming to a new country, coming to Canada and what that means, and to talk about the original inhabitants, right out the gate. I think it leads to what could be a future of reconciliation for all. I think it is an important step. I don't think we can trivialize it. I think, Bill C-8 is important, and I'm proud to support it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.